All right, so I want to know your experiences. So right away, I want to know your experiences with the word race. And the reason why I asked this question is because you know how for the whole quarter we've been talking about language, right? Language and how language in a lot of ways is a word has its own concept around it. We saw how, you know, when we were looking at semiotics, and as we get better and better at understanding semiotics, we realize that, you know, once we're in that second level of science signification, that words become very powerful, right? So when we're talking about the word race, right, that's a very powerful word. So how do you understand it? What's your experience with that word?
It's overrated.
Okay, it's overrated.
I have some first-hand experience. When I was growing up, I was in Milwaukee, which is actually it has some of the highest segregation levels in the country. And like I was friends with a black guy. He was one of my best friends, and I couldn't really go to his neighborhood much, or I had to be with him because the racial tensions there were so high that I would be in danger if I was like a white person alone in that area.
Okay, let's hold on to that idea because we'll talk about this. Any other experiences? So you said it's overrated. You had your own experience. Your own agency was challenged. What about you?
A lot of people are too shy from even talking about it.
Right.
It scares them. They don't want to hit a button or say something.
Oh, I totally agree with you. That happens a lot. Or there's always the fear like, oh, you're going to pull the race card, or what does that mean when you're using that terminology, right? Now, if we're going to be social scientific about it, if we're going to be looking at it from a semiotic perspective, the first thing that we're going to do is let's try to figure out what the origins of this word is. And all of a sudden, we hit a wall. Because in Latin, like if we start looking at the original languages, right, that gave us these words, race does not exist. This notion of race does not exist. The only thing that's closest to this is, and I think we've talked about this already, Barbaros, the Greek Barbaros. Remember Barbaros? So that's where our word barbarian comes from. And it's, remember bar. It's because you can't speak Greek very well. You sound like you're going bar, right? So the word barbaros usually is one of these terms that was used to show that there was an other, that you were not Athenian, you were not this or that. And so this is where we first see the first split, you know, us and then them. And the term was barbarian, right? Not when we think of barbarian, like, killing people. But the idea is that it's that you are the other, you're not civilized. There's also a notion of civilization, right? We've talked about this already, right? The civilized and uncivilized, right? The anarchist versus the cultured folk, right? And so we see this in Athens, we see this in Rome, we see this other places, but the word in and of itself does not actually exist previous to what we'll see in 16th century. When the word comes up to describe bloodlines or groups of people, but not in the way that we understand groups of people. It's more like, from referencing a tribe, right? It's that group over there, but it was not there to distinguish or make, do us or them scenario. It was more just to distinguish bloodlines. And when we see it used in France, because we see it in Middle French actually in the 1500s when it's first used. It's used to indicate nobility. You're of noble race, so there's this nobility that's attached to it. Okay. Well, there's been arguments around this term for quite a while, because anthropologists were like, well, there's in Arabic there's this word, and then in Spanish there's this word, and then in Old Italian there's this word. Well, again, I'm going to go and defer to the French because they're the ones who kind of really played with this a little bit more. So, Story might talk about it in terms of like 1700s, 1800s. I'm going to take it even further. Many people agree that this notion of racism, or at least the first practices, have nothing to do with this bloodlines, that have everything to do with kind of an extension of this us and them. We start seeing this distinction, I would say, probably at the end of the Roman Empire, where we see the difference between Christians, Jews, and then later the Muslims, or Islam.
The Crusades.
Islam does come later, right? Because Islam is
The
much
Crusades.
later. Exactly. So our first iteration of making these distinctions actually have a religious basis to it. And that religious basis is basically you're either a Christian, a Jew, later on, like I said, Islam, because Islam is relatively new, or you're this pagan, you're this heathen. So for the longest time, you have these traditions, these distinctions, where the Christians are kind of mad at the Jews for a while, like the Jews. Why don't the Christians like the Jews?
Killed the Savior.
They killed Jesus, right? They killed Jesus. And of course, that makes me laugh, because it's like, well, if you were reading your book really well, you do realize that that had to happen.
Yeah.
It didn't matter who was going to. That was part of the fulfillment of your, of the prophecy, that it had to happen. So, like, why are you mad?
Yeah.
It had to happen for you to be saved. But they made this distinction. And so, interestingly enough, what happens in this scenario is you have these situations, especially during the late Middle Ages, where people of Jewish ancestry were essentially not allowed to own land, or they couldn't go into certain professions. And oftentimes they use biblical references in relation to those traditions and those practices, or that hegemony for that period. And interestingly enough, those people ended up going into commerce, because commerce was something that you could do as a Jew, right? Because money could be exchanged, and you can ask for, you could ask for like interest on stuff, because in the Bible you're not supposed to ask for interest on stuff. Does anyone remember a story in the Bible about money lending and stuff?
You're not supposed to lend or ask to get a loan ever.
Right, exactly. And so what happens? You have commerce. Christians are not allowed to lend or to ask for interest. So, well, here's this population that's working with a monetary system. It's going to be a lot of jealousy, right? So we actually see these iterations later on, because if we really start looking at this notion of race, like I said, we don't see it too much later, because if you look at artwork from the Middle Ages into the humanist era, into the Renaissance, well, even into like the 17th century, you're going to see different people of color. They didn't really have those constructs. They thought of them in terms of their heritage, right? These people are coming from here or there. In the 17th century, for example, you'll see in Molière, who's a comic playwright, one of the main characters is very excited about the prospect of his daughter marrying a sultan. If racism existed at that point, that would have been a no-no. But he's like, the guy's like, oh, he's gonna marry a sultan. We're gonna have nobility. This is great. When the sultan, at the particular moment when the play was written, there had actually been a sultan that had come from Africa, northern Africa actually, to visit the king, and everyone was excited about that, right? So there had been already, even beforehand, contact with other cultures. Right? We had the spice trade, right, all the way to India, right? Christopher Columbus, what is he doing? He's trying to find a passage to India. We'll leave the Spaniards aside for a moment.
And Columbus wasn't that great.
No. But I want to come from the idea here of the barbaros in relation to that. But it just very simply, before we really start talking about racism, we really are talking about the distinguishing characteristics of what makes you Christian, what makes you Jew, and what makes you other. All right, that starts to change as our definitions start to change, because what happens around the end of the 17th century? What do we start seeing? This is something that you've been doing in World Cid. You probably started it specifically with this area. Anybody remember? Everyone heard of the French Revolution, right? So the French Revolution, what prompts it?
The American Revolution?
No, the French.
The French
That was
Revolution.
Rich versus poor, they were fed up with the monarchy.
Right, but before that, you have to have those ideas already circulating, correct?
Mm-hmm.
So this is the age of the Enlightenment.
Oh, yeah.
Didn't those ideas originate with the American Revolution?
These ideas were started with humanism.
Yeah.
They were borrowed. The American Revolution borrowed ideas of Rousseau, for example. These ideas of, we are born free, we're born good, and it's society makes a mess and mockery of humanity, blah, blah, blah. De Tocqueville will come to America to study America as it's building and bring back some of those ideas back to France.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of conversation, because one of the other things that oftentimes we don't hear about is during that time, Thomas Jefferson was going to France constantly. He was going back and forth. So there was a lot of contact back and forth. And there was a lot of points of contention with France and England, right? France wanted England to just fall apart, right? And America, of course, was breaking away, so there was definitely that link that we'll see. But there was already what I would consider cross-pollination of ideas. But the ideas had already started a long time before. I would say the end of the 17th century, where people started rethinking this whole monarchy system. But it isn't until around the French Revolution where you see this explosion, where everyone's like, no, we can't, this just got to stop. I'm oversimplifying it, but that's essentially what's happening. But I want to go to the Enlightenment because we're dealing with ideas. And one of the ideas in reference to the Enlightenment is the fact that, you start questioning, again, we start questioning this kind of, trickle down scenario. You have, the aristocracy, the clergy, and then you have everybody else. Right, and so in a lot of ways, these are the ones that are supporting, but that's because there's an edict somewhere that says that, this is the way heaven's set up, so this is just an imitation of what heaven looks like. Well, when you start bringing ideas and you start questioning those things, obviously you start realizing that, hey, maybe these things are not so much like that. And so what the Enlightenment starts looking at, it starts to look at science, and what it likes to do is this. This is something that we start seeing, for example, with the Encyclopedia Project of the period in France, where they're essentially doing these encyclopedias where they're showing people how things work, the mechanisms, physics, all these things that already you start seeing people in the 17th century work out, the precursors to calculators, some other scientific explorations and experimentation. And we have a science that's not really the science that we know today, but it's a science. And it's also science that's coming from where? Any idea where the science is coming from? Who's the scientist? Just any old Joe down here?
The people who can afford to.
Exactly, the people who had the means, right? And where did they get their knowledge?
The precursors to
Yeah.
them.
Like Like their original research or like the information that they
The
started?
information.
The Bible?
Well, in some cases, yeah, there were, you had, in some cases where you had biblical, belief systems, and you try to make your science kind of fit with that, right? Well, the science, again, in this particular case, is being done by an elite group of people that don't have the foundations like we know nowadays. So, as you start ordering your society, you start, again, this goes back to what we've been talking about in semiotics, where as you start ordering your society, you start adding a value to it. During the Enlightenment is this moment where the Europeans are going abroad, and now they're bringing stuff from other places. They're interacting with other cultures. The difference now than previously is there's this notion that that other is definitely an other because there's one, they're not Christian. So we see this in Canada where the French go to Canada and try to minister to the different indigenous groups there, and essentially refer to them as noble savages. Right? They don't have civilization, but they're noble. They're not killing everybody, or they're not killing each other. So there's a nobility about them. Also, they started noticing other aspects in the sense that a lot of places they were visiting, they were interfacing with, interacting with, but weren't necessarily developed in the same way. Right? They didn't have castles and all this stuff. What do you think? So you're an explorer, and you show up and you see all these people that don't necessarily have guns, that don't have these palaces.
Depends on your morals.
Yeah.
That's a hard, yeah. Okay.
And we're using our morals from today and putting it back there.
But it's kind of what I was talking about earlier at the beginning of the quarter, right? When we're looking at, if we're looking at 2014 mentality and we're trying to apply it to 1950s or whatever, but here they're looking at it from their lens, right? Their perspective lens, the European lens. Well,
Exploit.
well, even before that, it's, oh God, this is interesting.
Savage.
They're uncivilized, right? They're uncivilized because they don't have art, they don't have literature, they don't have music, right? The things that you're used to, and they don't have this kind of development. So clearly, something's not right. And you see these images, for example, in French Canada, in some of the churches, you'll see some old images where you have the Jesuit priests, ministering to these people, and they obviously are always at the top, and there's all this civilization behind the Jesuit priest, and then nature behind the indigenous folks, right? But again, that other becomes something to look at, to study, to be interested in. Also, you might be when I think of the Algonquins. In Canada, these are people that were very peace-loving. They lived off the land. They weren't warring, indigenous tribes, and so it was just so odd for them, the Jesuit priests and the French that had come, that they were just in awe that you had this civilization that lived on the land, and that's about it, right? Very complex social systems, but they didn't see that. Right? They weren't thinking in those terms. So during this process of taxonomy, you start studying and you start writing, and you see this in a lot of Jesuit writings where they're writing about their experiences in these places. And it's not just that. I mean, you see other places, other authors that are writing about places that they're inventing. It's called the epistolary tradition. So there's this whole tradition that grows out of this new discovery of different places, where people are writing these novels that are supposed to be letters back and forth from different places that are actually, like I said, they're totally invented, and they supposedly visit all these other places and interact with all these other people, and it's a complete confabulation, and people are just eating these up by the droves. But it's like anything, right? When we think of just our nostalgic culture of America today. The movie Lincoln recently, Steven Spielberg's version of Lincoln. The next generations that are going to watch this movie, when they study Lincoln, they're going to potentially remember the movie itself and not really. Does that make sense? So that movie becomes more real to them than the actual history itself.
So it's visual.
Right, exactly. So when you're reading these stories, and it's so fantastic, right? All of a sudden, you get this image of, oh, this is what it must be like to be in the jungles of Africa, or this is what it must be like to be in the woods in Canada. Yet these people didn't even visit. Right? So you start, in their cultural imagination, you start seeing these, and they become exotic and something to be studied. Well, in the same process, you're also making these connections. These scientists are very interested in what, who they're interacting with. And coming from that lens, they also notice that color of the skin is also, I would say, commingled, or I should say, let's see, the color of skin and the fact that these people are not as developed, they make that weird connection. So it's like, well, you must be darker skinned, and you're not that developed, so there must be something wrong with you. You must not be as intelligent as we are. And what do you think is going to happen if I'm actually telling stories of these voyages and I meet these people? What am I going to tell people in Europe? Yeah, and a lot of times you're going to start seeing drawings. And what we start seeing is we start seeing drawings of these people, really exaggerated drawings, just to kind of connect them to this model of, hey, look at who these are. That they're barbaric, or they'll use the word barbaric. They're the noble savage. They're this or that, and they make the connection between intelligence and skin color. And then you see these weird treatises where, especially once we start looking at the slave trade, where you have a scenario where they start making apologies for the slave trade. They don't see anything wrong with it. Any idea why they wouldn't see anything wrong with the slave trade?
Because they think they're better than them.
That's part of it, but what do you think their justification is?
It works.
We're smarter in a white skin.
Okay, well, we're smarter, right? And the white skin is just a signifier, right? But the idea is, if they don't know any better, how do they know they're enslaved? Right? If they're not intelligent, they don't know they're enslaved. They're happy to have what they have.
We'd be giving them a gift. We're giving you culture. We're giving you clothes. We're giving you language.
Exactly.
You owe us.
That's kind of the attitude. You're right. You're right. And so in a way, this is kind of where we see the beginnings, and we start seeing this again around this area. So before, again, to summarize, these distinctions of othering starts, at least with the notion of the barbaric, then it gets thrown into the Christian, Jew, Islam scenario, and then it moves out into the taxonomies, where you have the science that is now justifying the differences in people. And again, that's problematic because it's based on very faulty science. The only problem is it becomes the foundation. So it's the same foundation that Hitler used. At some point, did you all talk about how Hitler had set up all these markers that they would look at people and they would have the color of the eyes, the nose shapes, the foreheads, all that? This is stuff that existed even before Hitler. In France, for example, the man by the name of Bertillon had got really interested in physiognomy. And again, this is because there's already a tradition of looking at people and looking at their physiognomy and try to think about what they're like. I mean, this is when phrenology is important, right? You've all seen those heads where supposedly the bumps on your head tell you a little bit about your personality and your behavior, which is total. It's a total bump. But the idea is that they're excited about this. So Bertillon, what he does is as they arrest people, they start, this is where we start getting our origins of our mug shots. They start photographing people and they start measuring. So they'll measure the length of their arms, the length of their fingers to their hand. They'll take photographs from the top of their head, from the side. So basically they're doing a really huge kind of, photography session with all these measurements, scientific measurements. And they come up with a scheme that the cops take with them that say, all right, this is the type that you should be looking for when you're looking for a criminal.
Don't look for the crime, look for the criminal.
So it's kind of like, you've all seen or read Minority Report,
Love that movie.
right? So what's the whole point there?
Stop the crime.
Stop the crime before it happens, right? Well, if you start catching all these people, right, that don't fit this type, what do? You think you're going to eliminate your crime?
They thought.
They thought, right?
Yeah.
So what do you think happened in France during this period of time?
People get pissed.
Well, people were, yeah, essentially you go around, you started rounding people up. And it just so happens the people they're rounding up were people who were poor, right? People who really in that society were not doing very well. I mean, this is just one example of how you can use science, right? These scientific facts, these taxonomies, and you think you're doing something good because you have a foundation already saying that this is what it is, and you have science to back it up. Again, this is before all the technologies that we have. So we have a faulty foundation, very faulty foundation. But racism is built on that faulty foundation. Unfortunately, that's the faulty foundation that we're still fighting today. Because now we have this definition and this redefinition. And that's one thing I want to talk about right here. So let's look at what John Story talks about in Race and Racism. And he says, the first thing to insist on in discussion of race is that there is just one human race. We know from science now, from biology, that there aren't different races. They don't exist. They just don't. Our human genome is our human genome. It's the same. It's just how we express, right? So race then ultimately becomes what? It's a socially constructed model, right?
It's not scientifically.
And it's not scientific, right? But sometimes you'll build a science around it, okay?
Yeah.
All right, so human biology does not divide people into different races. It is racism, and sometimes it's counter-arguments that insist on the division. So where we see these taxonomies that were already part of the Enlightenment, this is where we see that need to distinguish it, to the extent that people were actually looking to the Bible itself to see if there was something in there. And there are things in there that relate to it. Oftentimes people will talk about the story of Noah. And does anyone know the story?
You got all the animals on the boat.
Well, this is after the flood.
Because the world had, oh, you mean after?
It's after, yeah.
Oh.
All the animals got off the boat.
They all got off the boat, right?
The water went away.
No, so essentially what happens is in the story, and this is the story that is often related to kind of prove that we're supposed to be these distinguished or distinctive people. One of Noah's sons, Noah had been out working in the vineyard, right? And it just so happens that Noah had a little bit too much to drink, and was so drunk that hung out and went into his hut naked. One of his sons shows up and starts laughing at his dad. And Noah's other sons came in and said, "How dare you laugh at Dad? You're making fun of him. He's in a very vulnerable state." And he's like, "Look, he's drunk. It's funny. It's hilarious." Well, Noah wakes up and then sees his son laughing at him and then curses him and says, "Now you're going to be a servant." And the way it's interpreted is that son is then given the skin color, or the dark skin color, whereas his other sons are given the white skin color. So he's told at that point, "You will now be the servant to your brothers." And so that is oftentimes the biblical quote that'll be used to say, we see, it's even in the Bible, in the Old Testament, that people that are darker have to be our servants. It's already, in the Bible. There's even other scenarios in the Bible where they talk about, for example, when on the books in America, it was not okay to marry people of different, ethnic backgrounds because you didn't want to mix, because in the Bible you weren't supposed to mix, right? So there were these miscegenation laws that were on the books till the 60s, believe it or not. So this stuff, you would find either biblical references or you would have a pseudoscience that would create, these distinctions, and people fought for them, to make these distinctions real. And again, it's like what we've been talking about with Althusser, is that, ideology has a material reality, right? If you believe it strong enough, you're going to make it work in reality. And so you're going to create these institutions that keep that distinction. So you're going to use science, you're going to use religion, and even economics, to make sure that you can prop up your argument. It's the same institutions that often are used to maintain gender bias, right? Well, women are supposed to do that because, women did this in the Bible. Well, science says, women have a different body type and they should blah, blah, blah. And, economics. See what I'm getting at? So you can see it's the same argument, just a different body that you're referring to. Here we're referring to darker skinned bodies, right? That are not that different from a genetic component. So, God, we're only on the second sentence. Okay. So in other words, race is a cultural and historical category, a way of making difference signified between people of a variety of skin tones. And he says what is important is not difference as such, but how it is made to signify. How is it made meaningful in terms of a social and political hierarchy? Right? This is not to deny that human beings come in different colors and with different physical features, but it is to insist that these differences do not issue meanings. Right? So in and of itself, our skin color is not, there's no meaning behind it other than some of us can sit in the sun longer and get darker. Right? They have been made to me. They have been made to me. And so like we talked about signification, right? We use these institutions to signify. All right? So, moreover, there is no reason why skin color is more significant than hair color or the color of a person's eyes. In other words, racism is more about signification than it is about biology. And then he uses Paul Gilroy's observation, where he says, accepting that skin color, however meaningless we know it to be, has a strictly limited basis in biology, it opens up the possibility of engaging with theories of signification, which can highlight the elasticity and emptiness of racial signifiers, as well as the ideological work which has to be done in order to turn them into signifiers in the first place. So, like we talked about, ideology has, I keep coming back to Althusser because it seems to be like, wow, he really knew, he really understood how this happens, right? So if I really want this to work, I'm going to make it work, and I'm going to set up institutions around it. So slavery is a good example of an institution that made this work. We say now, hey, that was wrong, but they made it work for themselves until somebody started questioning it, right? Okay, this perspective underscores the definition of race as an open political category, for it is a struggle that determines which definition of race will prevail and the conditions under which they will endure or wither away. So this should not be taken for a form of idealism. Difference exists whether it is made to signify or not. But how it is made to signify is always a result of politics and power rather than the question of biology. And so this is the area that I find I'm constantly battling with people around this notion of race, because everyone's always talking about race, and we're hearing this word, but it means so many different things, and that's why I asked you at the beginning, what does it mean to you? Because again, it's a very powerful word, but it's also a word that has a lot of ambiguity attached to it. Right? Because one of the things that is also problematic about this word itself is when we think about it from a historical perspective, oftentimes, at least when I think about it in America, we think black, white. And then all the other colors just seem to disappear. Isn't that interesting? Did you ever think about that before? It's like everything's disappeared, but everyone's like black, white. So there's this weird kind of power that we've given to those terminologies. What is white? What is black? You know, oftentimes I hear people will say, well, you know, I'm white, so I really don't have a culture or ethnicity, and I find that really funny, right? So what does it mean for you? So now let's think about this now. So now that from what we've been talking about, how does race now, how have you seen it used in ways that are ambiguous, or you're not really sure, or where you've seen it? Oftentimes I see it, you know, I hate to say this, but you know, watching Jerry Springer, it always comes up, right? And no one disarticulates it. Everyone continues using the word race, 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 and you keep hearing it, and then everybody just, right? The media is very powerful that way.
Something I think is hilarious is when you apply for a new job and they ask you, what is your race? But they say also in the fine print, we do not discriminate against any ethnicities, race, or sexuality. But why are they asking you for your race?
Right.
It's marketing. Like,
Wouldn't
they
that,
want to know
wouldn't
they're
that just
hiring.
be more of a numbers thing? Like,
Right, but see, that's even problematic. As much as I understand that there is still, and we'll talk about this, that there's institutionalized racism. It still exists, right? And that becomes a numbers game, and this is where you have people that are anti-affirmative action are saying, well, you know, they're just doing this quota, you know, what if you have blah, blah, blah. It's like, well, that's a hard question because, again, what I've heard often around this is like, well, that's because it's what's what I'm looking for? It's reverse racism. That's it.
If they weren't, well, see, the thing is funny about it, if they weren't being racist, there wouldn't be a quota. They wouldn't have to hire a certain number of,
Right.
whatever.
And that's the great point. Exactly.
Based on the
Exactly.
numbers.
And so the whole point of reverse racism is almost ridiculous, primarily because if we're looking at it from a social and a historical construct, right? Just as a social historical construct, it's almost absurd to say that reverse racism exists. Because that would mean the whole playing ground is level from the beginning.
Right.
Bias is a different story, definitely. But when you're talking about racism, right, you're looking at, because again, what happens is you get race, that conflation of your cultural background and the color of your skin somehow get commingled, right? It's like, you're Latino, I get, you know, you're Latino. Well, you don't act Latino. It's like, do I have to like do a hat dance? Like, what am I supposed to do to, you know, I can be me, and I can have that ethnic background, but I got all these other, you know, why do I have to be a race, right? I have an ethnic background. I don't see any different, you know, any differences, and I think that's important, and I have to remind people that don't conflate those two, because then what happens is you have what's called essentialism. And that's a very dangerous place, because this is also, again, going to be used when we're talking about other concepts where they'll say, well, that's just how women are, that's just how men are. Is it? Right? We have certain biological, you know, things that we do, but that doesn't, our biology doesn't make our destiny.
Right.
Right?
Our biology doesn't determine how we act.
Exactly. So, you know, again, and we'll see that when we start looking at gender a little closer, we'll realize that our cultures actually are the ones that push our gender on us. We get it from the, day one, but essentialism is what's problematic. It's like, so this is what it means to be white. Oh, you wouldn't get it, you're black, or you wouldn't get it because you're white. What does that mean, right? For me, it means you're being lazy and you want to disarticulate the concept. That's what it means for me, and you don't want to have to talk about it. And it's what you were talking about earlier about people being shy about asking this question because you're afraid of pushing buttons. When, for me, I feel it's an important conversation to have because once we disarticulate this question, all the other questions about gender, about social class, that starts to fall apart too because we start realizing, oh, we've put meaning or we put significance on something that really, in the big picture, is all socially constructed. That, just because I, grew up in this background doesn't mean that I have to be this. Because oftentimes you'll hear people will say, well, you know, you Latinos are, you know, you're hard workers and you're this or that. Okay, but aren't you a hard worker? Like, where does that come from? You know, well, I just, you know, I see you and so again, there's that connection, and that's a dangerous thing. We see this all the time. All we have to do is watch what's happening right now in our culture around the healthcare system. Oh, there's all these people that are going to just freeload. And then oftentimes when you see the freeloaders, what do they show as an image? They try to be very careful, but they always slip it in.
Black people.
And it's not just black people, it's usually people of color. They'll slip it in like, oh, well, they're, you know.
Whatever the PC term is.
Right.
But you're right.
Isn't that the same thing with like advertisements? They have a few different advertisements that they put over in Europe, and it's all white people. And then they have the same advertisement set up the exact same way, but you have different races.
You don't even need to leave the country, just change the channel. I mean, you depending on the channel, will show you different people
Right.
that are doing different things. You can get a Viagra commercial with 10 different people in it.
Exactly, and the thing is that makes sense because they're looking at their particular market. But the point is at what point is it? Do you start, especially for a culture like ours, where we see so many different faces and variations that you wouldn't see. You know, I'm not saying you have to do it, but it'd probably be in their best interest that you did, that you start putting different faces on work. But I mean, we're getting there. We're, you know, when I consider the, you know, some of the questions that come up, especially over the Coke ad. Remember the Coke ad that made everybody upset?
Why did that?
Well, why do you think it made people upset?
The multilingual.
The multilingual Coke ad just had everybody crazy, and of course, I find that funny because, you know, for me, that ad was just there to sell Coke, right? That's all it was there for, and that was a clever ploy because in a lot of ways, like whoever did it knew that it would make a lot of people upset, and that it would get super hyper politicized. But then the thing is, everybody would be talking about Coke, and what better way to get your brand name out there than to have people talking about it constantly?
Whole channels were just having huge just covers like the Coke ad scandal.
Right, and then you have on one hand, you know, your people that see themselves for the first time, you know, maybe in the Coke ad. I mean, they may see themselves in other places, but they see themselves and they hear their language, you know, and they're like, and then all of a sudden they become loyal to Coke. You know, that's what Coke was looking
Speaks
for.
our language.
Right, exactly. It reminds me of that. I don't know if you've ever seen it. You probably, if you YouTubed it, but it's that whole, you know, I'd like to buy the world a Coke. It's that they did it for Christmas. It was like a Christmas special. I'd like to teach the world. You know that one? Yeah, it's the same kind of idea. I mean, Coke's always had this kind of let's all get together, kumbaya, you know, scenario.
Or the Cheerios commercial a couple of years ago, which had the biracial family.
Right.
There was outrage over that.
It's weird because, like, how does a product appeal to everybody's taste, like, culturally?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it makes sense. It makes sense. There's just certain things, like you're not going to, you know, there's certain things that, you know, somebody who's got, you know, lighter skin is not going to need certain products because their skin might not be prone to getting ashy, or it's not prone to, you know, people who have oily skin are not going to want other products that you can't use because it just doesn't work for their skin. It makes sense, right? But it's the signification of it, right? It gets even more complicated because of this essentialism that I've been talking about. And that's where it becomes problematic. And because oftentimes you see people who, or you hear this, and I've had this conversation with a couple of friends of mine too, where again they say, well, we are this, and so it's kind of normal to us. Well, what do you mean by it? It's normal to us? It's normal that it's a characteristic of our heritage, or why are you taking it further? Because oftentimes I hear it taken further, like, well, that's how, like, you know, that's just how black people are. That's how, you know, Mexicans are. It's like, what do you mean by that? See what I'm getting at? But I want to get back to this idea of this notion of white and black. Because what I see constantly in the conversation is this idea, not so much about the binary, But when we start to talk about diversity, we always start with white as being the center. And then we kind of work our way out. Do you see a problem with that?
Yeah. It basically is saying like white is like the norm, or it's the average, or the generic, or the general.
And then we have the gradations of color,
Yeah.
right? That's problematic. So for us, in cultural theory, we try to say we have to get away from this notion of white being the center. Not on the color of the skin, but on the power of this word itself. This word is very powerful. Because it's not really a question of being white anymore. What does it really mean? What does this word really mean? If we take skin color away, what does this word really mean?
In today's world, other. I mean, if you're talking, like, I was thinking a questionnaire, you know, what is your ethnicity? African American, Indian American,
Everything with a hyphen, right?
or at the bottom, white.
Yeah.
It's the other.
There's white people in Europe. Why can't be a white American?
But the word, if I use the word, no, and then güero, Spanish. You hear this one in blanquito, blanco. Oops.
Yeah.
You hear this a lot, and I'm speaking from Spanish. Like you'll hear this in France, and you hear this, in Mexico. But it's often referred to not so much as the skin color, but a principle, a concept. Go ahead.
Do you ever watch Vsauce?
Yes.
Who?
Vsauce? It's a channel.
It's a YouTube channel.
No, I haven't
He
seen
just did a video recently about the word white, or what he was part of the video. He talked about the root blank, and he said that depending on the language, that word either turned to what means white or what means black. And I thought that was really interesting.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah, for me, what's interesting about this term again is I'm borrowing it from a semiotic perspective, right? Because clearly this word signifies at the first degree, right? This color of this thing, right? That's it, white. This is the color. But how is it that it came to get so packed with so much meaning?
We applied so many things to it.
So give me some examples of how white means in our culture, in our contemporary culture.
Power, security.
Power, security, oftentimes, yeah, power.
Money.
Stability in living. Happy family. Nuclear family.
Right, because when we think about the white picket fence, right?
Yeah.
Right, the white picket fence. Stability,
America.
money, what was it? I heard other ones?
Power, security, money, stability. Family.
Family,
If you break it
Perfect
down,
family.
it's pure and clean.
right, it's pure and clean.
Yeah.
Right, and we see this even in religious conversation, right? That white is often connected to, again, and that's more Western than anything.
Right. White means many different things in different cultures.
Right, but in this particular case, when we're talking about the West, right? Then all of a sudden, we see that this notion of white is actually not so much a skin color, but a principle. And so it makes sense that when this conversation happens in the media, it's because it's always drawing from the center, which is white, and then it moves out. So what's happening in mainstream media is there hasn't been this conversation about decentering this idea. Here's the other part that gets problematic. So, say somebody grows up with darker skin, and then all of a sudden, they don't grow up necessarily in the same kind of environment where you grew up, or say a whole majority of Latinos or African Americans live, right? You grew up, your dad and mom, your dad's a doctor, your mom's a professor, and you just so happen to live, in a university town. You just happen to have darker skin, so you don't necessarily have access to the other culture. That makes sense? So you grow up, absorbing that culture that's around you. And yeah, and so very interesting things happen at that particular point.
Not to be racist, but not to sound racist, but not to sound racist. My grandma hates collards. Wait, is that racist? Why isn't there a white entertainment television? Jews were slaves too. You don't hear us complaining about it all the time. Is it like bad to do blackface? Is that still like a thing? You can say the N-word, but I can't? How is that okay? My best friend was black. I mean, she's still black. Oh, we're not really friends anymore. Oh my god, I'm practically black. Twinsies! I told you to stop borrowing my lotion. Why is my computer acting so ghetto? This is so ghetto. I'm not really the black guy, so. So cute for a black guy, right? That one kind of looks like you. Tanisha, what did you do to my computer? Can I touch it? Okay, I'm already touching it a little. Is this real? Is this all yours? Wait, it's not real? It is. It is. Okay, sorry. So happy. Kind of feels like a Brillo pad. Oh, did that hurt? Oh, sorry. Sorry. You guys can do so much with your hair. Kind of feels like Cheetos. Hey, do you know a Tyrone Jenkins? He just requested me. I don't know, he's black. Girlfriend, holler, holler. Sorry, girlfriend. He could get it. Sorry, do you want me to turn it down? I don't really like rap. I gotta call you back. There's an overread on them. I think what I like the most about them is they're not like stereotypical like black people. You know what I mean? It's almost like you're not black. Have you seen this shit black girls say? Kind of racist.
So you've never seen this before? It was like a huge meme. But what are some? When you notice like some of the things that she's questioning in terms of our conversation, she's using comedy as a way to make this commentary, right? So how's she playing with this?
It's not just words, a lot of it is somewhat derogatory too.
Like saying for a black person, or even though it's a black person, like that's just wrong. It's being racist while trying not to be racist. Or
But I'm going to be careful to saying wrong, because again that becomes I mean it's problematic. I want to use the word problematic because again we're still trying to take apart this construct, right? I don't want to be moralizing, even though yes I do feel it's wrong, but at the same time let's try to understand why it's problematic. You're going to say?
Like, it seems like she's dancing around the racial line while pointing at it, kind of thing. I mean, the way she was saying it was, oh, well, I don't mean any of this to be offensive, but here's a whole bunch of offensive stuff.
Right.
You know, for a black guy, why did you have to throw that on the end? Why can't he just be kind of cute? Period.
Right.
Like, why for an Asian guy, for a black guy, for a white guy?
But it's what she was saying earlier too.
Yeah.
That those hot buttons, you know, it's like sometimes we'll preface these things and don't realize it. And I think what's happening too is it goes back to what we're saying is that again, putting that at the center and then looking out, right? So it's this idea of oh gosh, I just lost my thought. This kind of entitlement that happens. So I think she does a really good job at showing how oftentimes when there is a tendency to, you know, look at somebody, and it's happened to me too. It's not, you know, not just her, where someone will grab my hand or grab my arm and then look at my skin or be like, oh, I love your skin. And it's like, I didn't say you could grab my arm and feel me up. Right? It's kind of the same idea where guys, I know guys have done this. I've seen this. I go with my friends sometimes, my women friends will take me out to a bar because they don't want to be grabbed by guys. Because guys just come up to them and just go, hey, how you doing? And just start grabbing on them. And they're like, when did that become okay to just come up and grab on you? It's not this. And so in this case, it's like you'll have people, and I've had other friends of mine where, you know, they'll have dreads or whatever, and they just reach out and grab, before even saying, hey, can I touch your hair? And they just grab their hair. It's like, oh, this is so cool. Do you see the problem?
Yeah. It's like a personal boundary.
Exactly. It goes because the narrative is still central, right? So because we haven't just articulated this, you being aware of your own privilege or all this stuff, in a way, sometimes it doesn't give you enough pause to realize that there's a sense of entitlement that happens. I'm not saying, oh, bad, evil people. It's just that we haven't interrogated it enough. Okay? And I think that's a question that's important, is people understand where their privilege is coming from. I have privilege myself, right? There's some spaces where I can exercise my privilege and I'm aware of it. So again, it's one of these cases we want to be very careful to start to kind of dislocate it a little bit. Does this bring some other ideas to your
Gays.
Yeah, exactly. What is the focus of what is our media tends to focus, and I actually want to bring this up really because you're making a really good point here. So when people talk about gays, right away it tells us a lot about our society. What is the first thing everyone worries about?
Marriage?
No.
No.
Is this guy gonna start looking at me like a chick?
Remember this power, right? If men hold the power in the society, is this guy, he's gendered, will he start looking at me as a chick? As a chick.
Yeah. It goes back to
That's from my experience with being in the military.
But you're making a solid point, because it goes back to essentialism, right? It's like dudes have to act like dudes, and you know, chicks have to act like chicks. What does that mean, right? And then when there's a potential of a variation, right, and all of a sudden it's like, am I going? It's almost, sometimes it makes me think that it's more because they realize that they don't have power over the other person, that by actually letting, you know, like having the person possibly objectify them like they objectify women,
Yeah.
It seems very problematic.
No, and that's where they get all defensive about it, or like really defensive in the fact that they don't want to be around you, in the sense that they don't want to see if you're judging them in certain different ways that they don't understand, or I don't know, the fact that
I think it's mostly just the fact that they don't understand what's going on, and then jump to those conclusions.
Well, because
from their own experiences.
But you're making a really good point, because we don't even understand our own gender and sexuality in this culture. We never talk about it openly.
No. It's all very hush-hush and taboo. Like, you never really learn anything about it in school, even though they say they teach you. You don't really, you learn like the basics in the anatomy.
Right, and what you see, you'll see, you know, when you'll find people, now, this is, I mean, your generation is very different from my generation, but, you know, I'm seeing more and more generations where kids are comfortable with their bodies just in general, because they've been taught at home to be comfortable with their bodies. They have no issues around orientation. Like, they're like, what's the big deal? And I find that really interesting, because my generation still deals with it constantly. I mean, we just saw, just recently, you know, we saw several things happen with the football player just came out. That, you know, such a big stink around him.
Ellen Page came out.
Ellen Page, right. But just even before, Sherman, when he was like going off, right? It wasn't like he was just like letting some steam off. It was, no, he was a thug, right? We're using that language because like, we made that essential, oh, he's an angry black man, because all black men are angry.
I'm a black man in the alley.
Right? And then you know, the other part is but you're making a really interesting point too, Andrew, in the sense that, you know, I don't want to be viewed as, you know, if another man looks at me, I don't want to be perceived as Nelly. Because if he's looking at me, then I must be throwing out some gay vibe, you know?
Right. But it's actually really bad, because from my observations of like guys in the military, they're gayer than most gay men. The fact that they just like...
What do you mean?
I came from the submarine force. I mean,
Well-
the homosexuality, while not a lot of people were open about it, it was a very open thing. Like, I mean, there was no boundaries. Somebody would come up, put their arm around your shoulder, grab you on the butt.
Yep.
Were they gay? No, it's just the way things were. I mean,
But this
we
is-
tried to creep each other out with like who can make the first person uncomfortable.
Right.
That was a common game.
chicken.
But this is
Gay
not,
chicken.
yeah. But what you're talking about too is what we call homosociality. So, meaning that you're socializing, you're being intimate with people of the same gender, but it doesn't necessarily turn into a sexual relationship. It's just, let's hang out, we're guys watching each other. It's you see this in every era where you know, we can even go as far as the Roman centurions and the knights during the Middle Ages. You had your buddy, the person you loved the most in your life, because they were going to watch out for you. And you needed to develop those relationships because those relationships were going to keep you alive. Right? And very similar to here, you have your buddies, and then people, you know, when they get out of the militaries, they tend to stay buddies with their friends, you know, for some people, sometimes forever, because they have that bonding, that homosociality that they only understand because we were in war together, we were in conflict together, so we only get it. Because it's, you know, you're dealing with all these memories, right? So that's where the homosociality, and so oftentimes there's a lot of play that happens in relation to this. It has nothing gay about it, if you want. Wait?
Oh, it's very gay.
Yeah, but again, this is where, again, why, you know, if we're gonna, because we're gonna talk about queer theory at one point, but when we're looking at essentialism, like, what does it mean to be gay at that point, right? What does it mean to be a lesbian? What does it mean to be black? What does it mean to be, because oftentimes I hear, you know, it's like, well, you know, I'm not acting black enough, or I'm not acting this or enough, or whatever, or these essentialisms are funny. Let me give you another example of this. So you have a kid. I've known this all my life, right? I've known this kid all my life, and you know, very normal kid, and then you know, I don't see this person for 10 years, and I run into them again. And it's, oh, how are you doing? And then they're like super femme, super like intensely, like really performing this, and you're like, where did that come from, right? So I don't remember that. Not to say like, you know, that's bad. What I'm pointing out is, at what point does your community have an effect on how you behave, on how you live in society?
Fit into a stereotype?
Sometimes,
yeah. Like culture, like subcultures can sometimes self-perpetuate their own socially imposed stereotypes.
Exactly. And so oftentimes you'll see scenarios where you have people of that particular ethnic group. They'll make the distinction between between this group and that group. Like, for example, oftentimes you see that in many subgroups, especially people who have really done really well economically. They will create boundaries themselves within their own subgroups so that this lower group from a socioeconomic perspective cannot access them. I see this a lot with the Latino community, I see this with the African American community.
As far as from or against?
No, where once you have a group, they succeed, they become successful, they create this artificial boundary so that people that are possibly becoming upwardly mobile can't come up.
I've been seeing that more with the gay community.
Oh, absolutely.
It's actually getting really bad in the sense that, oh, you wouldn't understand, I'm gay. Or you're just putting me down because I'm gay. Or certain other things like that.
It plays exactly with the racial cards as well that we use.
Well, that's what I'm getting at from the beginning of the class, is that the importance of disarticulating this notion that these essentialisms, these, how the words themselves, gay, black, there's a behavior attached to it, and then we end up focusing on the behavior, we don't focus on the person itself. So everyone's like, they're being too loud, they're being, blah, blah, blah. Like, oh, the black people are too loud, or gay people are too nelly, or what? And the thing is, if you watch television, no one just articulates it. Everyone talks about this, and it continues like, you know, the thing that drives me crazy often when I'm watching anything is that any time, you know, whether again it's a person of color, oftentimes on regular television, it's hard not to see them building into the stereotype or working into the stereotype, because it's what sells, and then it gets perpetuated. And you talk about self-perpetuation. You know, when you consider, you know, if you really want to play with this, who's buying the rap albums, really?
I am.
You are, right?
Straight thug.
Right, the people who are buying the rap, like the pimp and hoe and you know, money, you know, drug, you know, gangsta rap, it's not that community that's buying it. It's these 13 to 21-year-old white middle class to upper class Caucasian kids. That's who's buying it. And so my favorite moment, I was watching this documentary, and it was basically looking at hip hop culture, and they were trying to problematize this idea that, you know, why is it that, you know, African American artists keep producing this kind of stuff? Well, obviously they'll produce it because they know there's going to be money, right? It sells, but at the same time, you know, it's that self-perpetuation that they're hurting themselves in many respects. And they had gone into this upper middle class neighborhood in Chicago. And they were at a Dairy Queen. The documentarians were at the Dairy Queen. And the documentarian said, "So why do you listen to this gangster rap music?" And the kids, I kid you not, said, "Well, we just want to understand what it's like to be them. So we listen to music so it's like so we can understand their soul." I was laughing so hard because if that's how you're going to understand this, you know, you're buying something that's totally manufactured for you, right? Manufactured for you because that's what you believe, right? That's what it's the same thing as what these guys were doing, you know, in Europe. They already have this idea of who you are. So if I hear something that's totally manufactured, well, there you go. See, you can always point to that, right? When you see any kind of manufactured, you know, identity on television, this essentialized identity, it's just going to confirm it. And it's funny because oftentimes it's just that shortcut that, you know, so you don't have to explain to people like, yeah, well, he's acting butch in this, even though he's a gay character. A good example of this, you know, this is, you know, maybe before your time, but Will and Grace.
I was about to say it.
Will and Grace is a good example of, you know, every time Will would actually do something or would flirt with a feminine side, he would always get beat down. If you watch the show, anytime he flirts with something that could be potentially effeminate, someone will make fun of him, someone will say something really horrible to him, and it's there to laugh at. And so in a lot of ways, it's that kind of social control, right? It's like Will's trying to be himself, and just because everyone's so aware of his sexual orientation that everyone becomes hyper aware, almost to the point of policing him. But this is true of every subgroup. Women do the same to each other. Yes? Since you're you police each other sometimes.
Yeah, but I wouldn't say in the gay sense.
Well, not so much the gay sense, but policing, like if you forget to wear makeup one day or just don't want to wear makeup, someone,
yes.
and it's just like, why are you doing? What's wrong with you?
Yeah.
Right.
But we don't joke around about being like lesbian as much as guys joke around about being gay.
Right, and I think the difference is because of the power structure that we live in, right? I think with women, what I have seen is oftentimes there's the oh, you're not you know, what are you wearing today? Why are you dressed like a guy? I've heard that before.
Well, see, I'm actually a longshoreman, and I wear baggy pants and sweatshirts and beanies, and at work, all the guys are always like, "Don't cut your hair. Everyone's gonna think you're a dyke." And I was like, I was never gonna cut my hair, but thank you for warning me. Like, I get that all the time.
Yeah, because they're so aware of your gender, and I'm sure that they even though they might not want to think about it, I bet you that at some point, maybe you had a really difficult task, and then you had people like, well, can I help you with this? Because
Yeah, it's really bad. It's really hard on the waterfront for women. I
Yeah.
deal with it all the time.
they feel like you're too delicate, you
Or
can't.
yeah, we're incompetent, we're too small, we're not strong enough. But on the other hand, we are also looked at as smart. Like when it comes to technology, sometimes it'll get pushed off on us because they just assume that we don't have the muscles, so we have the brains.
Isn't that interesting? Again, it goes back to essentialism. And oftentimes I like to remind people, it's like, women bear children. If a man tried to bear a child, we would lose it. We'd break apart. Our bodies are not set up for it. So let's be clear. Women are a lot stronger in the long run. They're more resilient than guys are. Let's just put it out there, right? And that's what's so funny, because again, it goes back to that essentialism, and it starts early. The day you're born, here you are. You have the female genitalia, you have the male genitalia. What happens? They put you in pink or they put you in blue. And then dad, what does he do with the little boy as he's growing up? He's a couple months old and whatever. He starts roughing it up. But the daughter, he will treat her in a very different way. They're still children. They're still just as resilient. You can bounce a baby and it wouldn't get up, right? But you see what I'm getting at? And so already our culture has told us that little girls are delicate, so you treat them delicately. When in the end, babies are babies. They're just as resilient. But it starts from the beginning, so the kids become used to that. And it's so interesting how we're so... Go ahead.
When you said that, it reminded me a couple of years ago, I was teaching the oldest one potty training. She pops off with this question, Daddy, how come I can't stand up when I pee? Well, sweetie, I had to explain to her that she doesn't have the right parts. And then the little one just the other day went up and pulled down her diaper, stuck her front end right up to the toilet and peed on the floor. I mean, she did exactly what Daddy did, but wrong parts. She didn't have a problem with it.
And that's awesome, because they don't, then at that point, by just not saying, it's like, all right, it's what it is. They don't have
good
shame. Good try, exactly. There's no shame, there's no shame about their bodies, right? And all of a sudden they start realizing, because then when they see the difference doesn't matter. The difference is just normal.
So, Daddy, why don't you sit down to pee? Because I can stand up, so well, Mommy sits down. Because she does. I have no way of, I don't know how to explain it to her other than Mommy
that's just the way it is.
Daddy stands.
And it becomes normalized. Yeah, again, and that's the interesting part, because why are you asking that? There's no shame at that point. So that's very healthy in a lot of ways.
The only issue I have is when I go into the bathroom and they follow me. It's like, I'm not ashamed of anything or trying to hide it, but can I have privacy for a minute? I am trying to. I know you're just curious, but I really have to pee and you're staring at me. Yeah. The little girls, they're awesome.
That kind of reminds me of something, it's probably one of my mom's favorite stories to tell about my little sister. She had cancer. She was real ill, and she would have to go to the hospital all the time. But anytime she goes to the hospital, they would always treat her really gentle. They'd say, oh, what a cute little girl, all that sort of stuff, just like princess it up sort of thing. And she hated it. She absolutely hated it, to the point where she wanted to emasculate herself. And there was this one nurse that she hated that would always come in and have to give her a shot. And she said something to be like, oh, how's the little girl today? How's the little princess? And she stands up on the bed, puts her hands on her hips, and sways back and forth and says, this is my dick. Don't treat me like a little princess.
That's awesome.
Good for her. Good for her.
Yeah, and that's again, and it's interesting because even in our culture, you got the balls, right? You got the balls. What does that mean, right? And again, those are such weighted terminologies. So again, we live in language, and we don't realize just how powerful that is in the end, and it makes us behave certain ways that we don't realize. And then when language then attaches itself to a signifier or a sign signifier, then all of a sudden it gets even more complicated. And then when you have a culture that starts adding and packing and things on, then it becomes even more, because You have to decide who's going to then disarticulate it. See, if I talk about this, to you, you're ready, you know, you're listening to this and then you're willing because that's what we're doing in class. Let's try to have this conversation out in the real world. How many people are going to want to listen?
Can we take it down to South Carolina?
Do you see what I'm getting at? People would shut down because, again, that politeness, or let's just not talk about it and hope that it just goes away. So, and again, it's not a matter of black or white anymore. For me, it's a matter of taking the words that have, you know, a place that's a social hierarchy, and taking them apart, understanding the origins of those words, and then just taking those things apart. And this is what Althusser wasn't thinking about. He was looking at the links, but he didn't think about, how do we take it apart now? How do we teach people to actually read and take it apart? So that's what he didn't think about. The people we're going to be reading next are the ones who are saying, hey, let me show you how you can break it apart. And so that's what I kind of want to end with today, and then we're going to watch the film Pinky, and so your assignment will be to write a little bit about the institutions that deal with this particular issue. The film is about a woman who is African American. It takes place around the same time, again, Rebel Without a Cause. The difference is now it's another kind of film where you see this change, again, after World War II, where African Americans now have money, they're starting to move up in society, and there's an anxiety around this notion of black and white. And you have Pinky, who her skin is light, and now she has to contend with the fact that she has that mobility in society, but there's that reality in the background that could potentially be problematic for her if she gets found out.